what would Twain be saying about that? What would Twain's counterpoint to that be?
He's asking God to also punish the other people that are being killed. Like, that would be the unspoken prayer of that, on the other side of you're actually killing other people.
Right, because we would never say that, right?
Yeah, you would say it.
You would always say you're doing this for freedom and all this kind of stuff. And Twain, in particular, went off on religion. He rewrote the words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. He said, "Mine eyes have seen the orgy of the launching of the sword. He is searching out the hoardings where the stranger's wealth is stored. He has loosed his faithful lightning, and with woe and death has scored. His lust is marching on." All right, that's fairly biting stuff. You know, this is a sacred national song, and Twain is suggesting it's all about, getting rich, getting wealth. He also more explicitly attacked people who justified kind of that manifest destiny Christian responsibility. He said, "I bring you the stately matron named Christendom, returning bedraggled, besmirched, and dishonored from pirate raids in China, Manchuria, South Africa, and the Philippines, with her soul full of meanness, her pocket full of boodle, and her mouth full of pious hypocrisies." That's fairly blunt. But at the end of the day, people like Teddy Roosevelt, who was the Secretary of the Navy, later to be president, had far more influence than Twain. And Roosevelt simply, essentially dismissed people like Twain, and he said, they're men of a bygone age having to deal with the facts of the present. And the facts of the present were going to be imperial conquest. Even so, that idea, people like William Jennings Bryan, I'll mention again, I couldn't find the speech, unfortunately. Bryan has this wonderful speech about the war. And he said, this war is damaging it's kind of like what Debs would say about World War I. This war is damaging the interest of average people. The people who are making profits on it are the guys who run the ships to pick up all the dead soldiers from abroad, and the guys who make the coffins to put them in. It's very biting, very harsh. And so you have this anti-imperial idea. So when the 1960s come around, this isn't like the first time people have said these kinds of things. They're actually fairly commonplace, and they have a historical basis. So in 1898, you have this anti-imperial movement is quite strong. At the end of the day, I think Teddy Roosevelt's encomium is best. They're men of a bygone age. It's kind of like, oh, isn't that cute? And you can kind of ignore them and dismiss them, all right? So, but again, what we have at the end of the century with regard to things like labor struggles, Pullman and Homestead, you have this anti-imperial movement. It really bespeaks to a large, radical movement within the United States. There's significant anger, significant anxiety over the shape that the government's taking, right? You fought this massive civil war not that long ago within memory of all these people. From 1898 to Civil War, that's only 30 years. Today that would be like remembering the Reagan administration almost. A lot of people do that, so it's not that long ago. But within that came, among all those things, probably I would say one of the more successful, if not the most successful, challenge to the capitalist state in U.S. history. And it occurred on the farms, it occurred on the prairie, and that was the populists. Anybody heard of the populists? What do you know about the populists? They were, what's the farmers? There were farmers. It was an agrarian movement, a rural, kind of a country movement. In the period after the Civil War, we talked about this serious problem of economic, kind of cycles. And farmers were hurt particularly badly because, as we've said before, the state, very early on, decided that they would foster industry. And so all of these state plans with regard to land and taxes and tariffs and subsidization and banking were designed to favor industry over agriculture. And so agriculture found itself in a particularly bad situation. In addition to that, I think I've mentioned this before, because of technology, there was a serious problem of overproduction. So all of these farmers were able to produce far more goods than they could ever sell. So you have this serious problem of overproduction, which is one of the reasons you go abroad. You look for countries abroad because you have to get rid of this surplus. And there's also a surplus of capital. You've invested so much money and produced so many goods, but you've overproduced now. So what's the point of continuing to use your capital to reinvest? right? And if you don't use your capital to reinvest, what is it then? What's the problem you have then? I mean, isn't that the cardinal principle, the cardinal sin? I mean, what's the dominant rule of capitalism? Reinvest. You have to keep spending the money, growing more things. You have to keep rebuilding, right? So you have surplus goods and surplus capital, right? And that's one of the reasons you go abroad, right, looking for new markets. Well, in the farm communities, this was particularly bad. Serious problems of surplus capital, and then serious problems, much like today, with regard to land ownership. A huge banking crisis, a lot of banks which were unregulated, totally unregulated. People want to get rid of the Fed, as bad as the Fed may seem, really need to look back on this era. When you have no bank regulation, essentially each bank can produce its own bank notes, even its own currencies, really. And so there's no banking regulation. So what you have in places like Indiana, Nebraska, Kansas are massive, massive land failures. Like half the people in some of these states lost their lands and left. Right? So there's this major farming crisis. Amid that, farmers realized we're not going to get any help from the government. The government favors industry, so we're going to have to take this into our own hands. And in the 1870s or so, you start to see the first stirrings of this groups like the Grange. You ever hear of the Grange? The Grange, Grangers. Well, if you're familiar with banks today, like or insurance companies like Mutual of Omaha, what's the one that was doing all the commercials during one of the football games? You say Farmers Trust or something like that. Planters Bank. Those were all started by farmers, because the typical banks, the Wall Street or the Philadelphia banks or the national banks, would not serve them well. If you're a banker and a couple people come in who want money, want to borrow money from you, they want to, take out loans to start a business. You want to create industry. You want to start a textile mill, and you want to buy more acreage to grow wheat. Okay, as a banker, who am I more likely to take care of? The textile, yes. So bankers are really kind of catching it. So they create, same with insurance companies, same with railroads. So these bankers favor industry. So farmers decide to kind of take it upon themselves to create their own institutions. And so you start to see things like Farmers, the Grange, Mutual of Omaha. Have you ever heard of that insurance company? They used to have a TV show when I was a kid called Wild Kingdom every week, sponsored by Mutual of Omaha. And even today, all over, just go over Houston, you'll see Planters Banks and Farmers Insurance and all that kind of stuff. Basically, the farmers said, we're going to have to take law into our hands. Now, a lot of these institutions actually started as kind of social groups too, because farm life is very isolated, and people live far away from their neighbors, and they would have ice cream socials and dances, and they would try to get the farmers' daughters together with the farmers' sons because they were very lonely, and sometimes the sheep started looking good and stuff like that. And from there, they started to take on an economic role. They began creating co-ops, cooperatives. And we talked about that briefly before, but what's a co-op?
Everyone owns a share in the company and has a say in what gets done.
You could have producing co-ops. Now, these guys still own their own farms, but they would have distribution co-ops and purchasing co-ops. So what do farmers need to do their job? What basic stuff do they need?
Plant. They need seeds.
They need seed. What else do they need?
Equipment.
They need tools, they need seeds. Now, if I go to the local store and buy it, I have to pay a certain price, right? I'm buying seed, or I'm buying a plow or whatever. But what if all of us get together and we decide how much seed we need, how many plows we need, and we forego that guy at the corner store, we go straight to the manufacturer, right? We create a purchasing cooperative. What's our price going to be like at that point?
Much lower.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to Costco or Walmart, it's just an economy of scale, right? You can buy one thing, but if you buy 2 or 3 or 4, they become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper all the time, right? If you buy enough, you get free shipping, and you get a toaster oven and all that kind of stuff. So they create purchasing co-ops. Then, in the same way, once you're done, once you reap your harvest for that season, and you've produced, doesn't matter, wheat, if you want to sell your wheat, how do you sell it? if you make anything, how would you sell it?
Middleman.
To transport it.
Yeah, you'd find somebody, an agent, who would sell it for you, right? So I produce wheat, then I find a wheat agent who's gonna go out and he's gonna sell it for me, right? And what are you gonna do? You're a wheat farmer, what are you gonna do? You do the same thing. So all of us are gonna produce wheat and find agents. Now, if I'm a big consumer, right, I make bread or whatever, and I have all these middlemen selling wheat, right? What advantage do I have? What advantage do I have?
You can trade people off of each other.
What's that?
Trade people off.
Yeah, I can get a better price that way, right? We have a tier 1 AV system.